The measurements of cognition. The end of an era was, for Don Juan, an accurate description of a process that shamans go through in dismantling the structure of the world they know in order to replace it with another way of understanding the world around them. Don Juan Matus, as a teacher, endeavored from the very instant we met to introduce me to the cognitive world of the shamans of ancient Mexico. The term cognition was for me at that time a bone of tremendous contention. I understood it as the process by which we recognize the world around us. Certain things fall within the realm of that process and are easily recognized by us. Other things don't and remain, therefore, as oddities, things for which we have no adequate comprehension. Don Juan maintained from the start of our association that the world of the sorcerers of ancient Mexico was different from ours, not in a shallow way, but different in the way in which the process of cognition was arranged. He maintained that in our world, our cognition requires the interpretation of sensory data. He said that the universe is composed of an infinite number of energy fields that exist in the universe at large as luminous filaments. Those luminous filaments act on man as an organism. The response of the organism is to turn those energy fields into sensory data. Sensory data is then interpreted, and that interpretation becomes our cognitive system. My understanding of cognition forced me to believe that it is a universal process, as language is a universal process. There is a different syntax for every language, as there must be a slightly different arrangement for every system of interpretation in the world. Don Juan's assertion, however, that the shamans of ancient Mexico had a different cognitive system was for me equivalent to saying that they had a different way of communicating that had nothing to do with language. What I desperately wanted him to say was that their different cognitive system was the equivalent of having a different language, but that it was a language nonetheless. The end of an era meant to Don Juan that the units of a foreign cognition were beginning to take hold. The units of my normal cognition, no matter how pleasant and rewarding they were for me, were beginning to fade. A grave moment in the life of a man. Perhaps my most cherished unit was my academic life. Anything that threatened it was a threat to the very core of my being, especially if the attack was veiled, unnoticed. It happened with the professor in whom I had put all my trust, Professor Lorca. I had enrolled in Professor Lorca's course on cognition because he was recommended to me as one of the most brilliant academics in existence. Professor Lorca was rather handsome, with blonde hair neatly combed to the side. His forehead was smooth, wrinkle-free, giving the appearance of someone who had never worried in his life. His clothes were extremely well tailored. He didn't wear a tie, a feature that gave him a boyish look. He would put on a tie only to face important people. On my memorable first class with Professor Lorca, I was bewildered and nervous at seeing how he paced back and forth for minutes that stretched themselves into an eternity for me. Professor Lorca kept on moving his thin, clenched lips up and down, adding immensities to the tension he was generating in that closed window, stuffy room. Suddenly, he stopped walking. He stood in the center of the room, a few feet from where I was sitting, and Banging a carefully rolled newspaper on the podium, he began to talk. "It'll never be known," he began. Everyone in the room at once started anxiously taking notes. "It'll never be known," he repeated, "what a toad is feeling while he sits at the bottom of a pond and interprets the toad world around him." His voice carried a tremendous force and finality. "So, what do you think this thing is?" He waved the newspaper over his head. He went on to read to the class an article in the newspaper in which the work of a biologist was reported. The scientist was quoted as describing what frogs felt when insects swam above their heads. This article shows the carelessness of the reporter, who has obviously misquoted the scientist. Professor Lorca asserted, with the authority of a full professor. A scientist, no matter how shoddy his work might be, would never allow himself to anthropomorphize the results of his research, unless, of course, he's a nincompoop. With this as an introduction, he delivered a most brilliant lecture on the insular quality of our cognitive system, or the cognitive system of any organism for that matter. He brought to me in his initial lecture a barrage of new ideas and made them extremely simple, ready for use. The most novel idea to me was that every individual of every species on this earth interprets the world around it, using data reported by its specialized senses. He asserted that human beings cannot even imagine what it must be like, for example, to be in a world ruled by echolocation, as in the world of bats, where any inferred point of reference could not even be conceived of by the human mind. He made it quite clear that from that point of view, no two cognitive systems could be alike among species. As I left the auditorium at the end of the hour and a half lecture, I felt that I had been bowled over by the brilliance of Professor Lorca's mind. From then on, I was his confirmed admirer. I found his lectures more than stimulating and thought-provoking. His were the only lectures I had ever looked forward to attending. All his eccentricities meant nothing to me in comparison with his excellence as a teacher and as an innovative thinker in the realm of psychology. When I first attended the class of Professor Lorca, I had been working with Don Juan Matus for almost 2 years. It was a well-established pattern of behavior with me, accustomed as I was to routines, to tell Don Juan everything that happened to me in my everyday world. On the first opportunity I had, I related to him what was taking place with Professor Lorca. I praised Professor Lorca to the skies and told Don Juan unabashedly that Professor Lorca was my role model. Don Juan seemed very impressed with my display of genuine admiration. Yet, he gave me a strange warning. "Don't admire people from afar," he said. "That is the surest way to create mythological beings. Get close to your professor, talk to him, see what he's like as a man. Test him. If your professor's behavior is the result of his conviction that he is a being who is going to die, then everything he does, no matter how strange, must be premeditated and final. If what he says turns out to be just words, he's not worth a hoot." I was insulted no end by what I considered to be Don Juan's callousness. I thought he was a little bit jealous of my feelings for Professor Lorca. Once that thought was formulated in my mind, I felt relieved. I understood everything. "Tell me, Don Juan," I said, to end the conversation on a different note. "What is a being that is going to die, really? I have heard you talk about it so many times, but you haven't actually defined it for me." "Human beings are beings that are going to die," he said. "Sorcerers firmly maintain that the only way to have a grip on our world and on what we do in it is by fully accepting that we are beings on the way to dying. Without this basic acceptance, our lives, our doings, and the world in which we live are unmanageable affairs." But is the mere acceptance of this so far-reaching?" I asked, in a tone of quasi-protest. "You bet your life," Don Juan said, smiling. "However, it's not the mere acceptance that does the trick. We have to embody that acceptance and live it all the way through. Sorcerers throughout the ages have said that the view of our death is the most sobering view that exists. What is wrong with us human beings, and has been wrong since time immemorial, is that without ever stating it in so many words, we believe that we have entered the realm of immortality. We behave as if we were never going to die, an infantile arrogance. But even more injurious than this sense of immortality is what comes with it. The sense that we can engulf this inconceivable universe with our minds. A most deadly juxtaposition of ideas had me mercilessly in its grip. Don Juan's wisdom and Professor Lorca's knowledge. Both were difficult, obscure, all-encompassing, and most appealing. There was nothing for me to do except follow the course of events and go with them, wherever they might take me. I followed to the letter Don Juan's suggestion about approaching Professor Lorca. I tried for the whole semester to get close to him, to talk to him. I went religiously to his office during his office hours, but he never seemed to have any time for me. But even though I couldn't speak to him, I admired him unbiasedly. I even accepted that he would never talk to me. It didn't matter to me. What mattered were the ideas that I gathered from his magnificent classes. I reported to Don Juan all my intellectual findings. I had done extensive reading on cognition. Don Juan Matus urged me, more than ever, to establish direct contact with the source of my intellectual revolution. It is imperative that you speak to him, he said, with a note of urgency in his voice. Sorcerers don't admire people in a vacuum. They talk to them. They get to know them. They establish points of reference. They compare. What you are doing is a little bit infantile. You are admiring from a distance. It is very much like what happens to a man who is afraid of women. Finally, his gonads overrule his fear and compel him to worship the first woman who says hello to him. I tried doubly hard to approach Professor Lorca, but he was like an impenetrable fortress. When I talked to Don Juan about my difficulties, he explained that sorcerers viewed any kind of activity with people, no matter how minute or unimportant, as a battlefield. In that battlefield, sorcerers performed their best magic, their best effort. He assured me that the trick to being at ease in such situations, a thing that had never been my forte, was to face our opponents openly. He expressed his abhorrence of timid souls who shy away from interaction to the point where even though they interact, they merely infer or deduce in terms of their own psychological states what is going on without actually perceiving what is really going on. They interact without ever being part of the interaction. Always look at the man who is involved in a tug of war with you, he continued. Don't just pull the rope. Look up and see his eyes. You'll know then that he is a man just like you. No matter what he's saying, no matter what he's doing, he's shaking in his boots, just like you. A look like that renders the opponent helpless. If only for an instant, deliver your blow then. One day, luck was with me. I cornered Professor Lorca in the hall outside his office. Professor Lorca, I said, do you have a free moment so I could talk to you? Who in the hell are you? He said with the most natural air, as if I were his best friend, and he was merely asking me how I felt that day. Professor Lorca was as rude as anyone could be, but his words didn't have the effect of rudeness on me. He grinned at me with tight lips, as if encouraging me to leave or to say something meaningful. I am an anthropology student, Professor Lorca, I said. I am involved in a field situation where I have the opportunity to learn about the cognitive system of sorcerers. Professor Lorca looked at me with suspicion and annoyance. His eyes seemed to be two blue points filled with spite. He combed his hair backward with his hand, as if it had fallen on his face. I work with a real sorcerer in Mexico, I continued, trying to encourage a response. He's a real sorcerer, mind you. It has taken me over a year just to warm him up so he would consent to talk to me. Professor Lorca's face relaxed. He opened his mouth and, waving a most delicate hand in front of my eyes, as if he were twirling pizza dough with it, he spoke to me. I couldn't help noticing his enameled gold cufflinks, which matched his greenish blazer to perfection. "And what do you want from me?" he said. "I want you to hear me out for a moment," I said, "and see whatever I'm doing, and see if whatever I'm doing may interest you." He made a gesture of reluctance and resignation with his shoulders, opened the door of his office, and invited me to come in. I knew that I had no time at all to waste, and I gave him a very direct description of my field situation. I told him that I was being taught procedures that had nothing to do with what I had found in the anthropological literature about shamanism. He moved his lips for a moment without saying a word. When he spoke, he pointed out that the flaw of anthropologists in general is that they never allow themselves sufficient time to become fully cognizant of all the nuances of the particular cognitive system used by the people they are studying. He defined cognition as a system of interpretation, which through usage makes it possible for individuals to utilize with the utmost expertise all the nuances of meaning that make up the particular social milieu under consideration. Professor Lorca's words illuminated the total scope of my fieldwork. Without gaining command of all the nuances of the cognitive system of the shamans of ancient Mexico, it would have been thoroughly superfluous for me to formulate any idea about that world. If Professor Lorca had not said another word to me, what he had just voiced would have been more than sufficient. What followed was a marvelous discourse on cognition. Your problem, Professor Lorca said, is that the cognitive system of our everyday world with which we are familiar, virtually from the day we are born, is not the same as the cognitive system of the sorcerer's world. This statement created a state of euphoria in me. I thanked Professor Lorca profusely and assured him that there was only one course of action in my case: to follow his ideas through hell or high water. What I have told you, of course, is general knowledge, he said, as he ushered me out of his office. Anyone who reads is aware of what I have been telling you. We parted almost friends. My account to Don Juan of my success in approaching Professor Lorca was met with a strange reaction. Don Juan seemed, on the one hand, to be elated, and on the other, concerned. I have the feeling that your professor is not quite what he claims to be, he said. That's, of course, from a sorcerer's point of view. Perhaps it would be wise to quit now, before all this becomes too involved and consuming. One of the high arts of sorcerers is to know when to stop. It appears to me that you've gotten from your professor all you can get from him. I immediately react with a barrage of defenses on behalf of Professor Lorca. Don Juan calmed me down. He said that it wasn't his intention to criticize or judge anybody, but that to his knowledge, very few people knew when to quit, and even fewer knew how to actually utilize their knowledge. In spite of Don Juan's warnings, I didn't quit. Instead, I became Professor Lorca's faithful student, follower, admirer. He seemed to take a genuine interest in my work, although he felt frustrated no end with my reluctance and inability to formulate clear-cut concepts about the cognitive system of the sorcerer's world. One day, Professor Lorca formulated for me the concept of the scientist's visitor to another cognitive world. He conceded that he was willing to be open-minded and toy as a social scientist with the possibility of a different cognitive system. He envisioned an actual research in which protocols would be gathered and analyzed. Problems of cognition would be devised and given to the shamans I knew to measure, for instance, their capacity to focus their cognition on two diverse aspects of behavior. He thought that the test would begin with a simple paradigm in which they would try to comprehend and retain written text that they read while they played poker. The test would escalate to measure, for instance, their capacity to focus their cognition on complex things that were being said to them while they slept, and so on. Professor Lorca wanted a linguistic analysis to be performed on the shaman's utterances. He wanted an actual measurement of their responses in terms of their speed and accuracy, and other variables that would become prevalent as the project progressed. Don Juan veritably laughed his head off when I told him about Professor Lorca's proposed measurements of the cognition of shamans. "Now, I truly like your professor," he said. But you can't be serious about the idea of measuring our cognition. What could your professor get out of measuring our responses? He'll get the conviction that we are a bunch of morons, because that's what we are. We cannot possibly be more intelligent, faster than the average man. It's not his fault, though, to believe he can make measurements of cognition across worlds. The fault is yours. You have failed to express to your professor that when sorcerers talk about the cognitive world of the shamans of ancient Mexico, they are talking about things for which we have no equivalent in the world of everyday life. For instance, perceiving energy directly as it flows in the universe is a unit of cognition that shamans live by. They see how energy flows, and they follow its flow. If its flow is obstructed, they move away to do something entirely different. Shamans see lines in the universe. Their art, or their job, is to choose the line that will take them, perception-wise, to regions that have no name. You could say that shamans react immediately to the lines of the universe. They see human beings as luminous balls, and they search in them for their flow of energy. Naturally, they react instantly to this sight. It's part of their cognition. I told Don Juan that I couldn't possibly talk about all this to Professor Lorca because I hadn't done any of the things that he was describing. My cognition remained the same. "Ah," he exclaimed. "It's simply that you haven't had the time yet to embody the units of cognition of the shaman's world." I left Don Juan's house more confused than ever. There was a voice inside me that virtually demanded that I end all endeavors with Professor Lorca. I understood how right Don Juan was when he said to me once that the practicalities that scientists were interested in were conducive to building more and more complex machines. They were not the practicalities that changed an individual's life course from within. They were not geared to reaching the vastness of the universe as a personal, experiential affair. The stupendous machines in existence, or those in the making, were cultural affairs, the attainment of which had to be enjoyed vicariously, even by the creators of those machines themselves. The only reward for them was monetary. In pointing out all that to me, Don Juan had succeeded in placing me in a more inquisitive frame of mind. I really began to question the ideas of Professor Lorca, something I had never done before. And meanwhile, Professor Lorca kept spouting astounding truths about cognition. Each declaration was more severe than the preceding one, and therefore more incisive. At the end of my second semester with Professor Lorca, I had reached an impasse. There was no way on earth for me to bridge the two lines of thought, Don Juan's and Professor Lorca's. They were on parallel tracks. I understood Professor Lorca's drive to qualify and quantify the study of cognition. Cybernetics was just around the corner at that time, and the practical aspect of the studies of cognition was a reality. But so was Don Juan's world, which could not be measured with the standard tools of cognition. I had been privileged to witness it in Don Juan's actions, but I hadn't experienced it myself. I felt that was the drawback that made bridging those two worlds impossible. I told all this to Don Juan on one of my visits to him. He said that what I considered to be my drawback, and therefore the factor that made bridging these two worlds impossible, wasn't accurate. In his opinion, the flaw was something more encompassing than one man's individual circumstances. Perhaps you can recall what I said to you about one of our biggest flaws as average human beings, he said. I couldn't recall anything in particular. He had pointed out so many flaws that plagued us as average human beings that my mind reeled. You want something specific? I said. And I can't think of it. The big flaw I am talking about, he said, is something you ought to bear in mind every second of your existence. For me, it's the issue of issues, which I will repeat to you over and over until it comes out of your ears. After a long moment, I gave up any further attempt to remember. We are beings on our way to dying, he said. We are not immortal, but we behave as if we were. This is the flaw that brings us down as individuals and will bring us down as a species someday. Don Juan stated that the sorcerer's advantage over their average fellow men is that sorcerers know that they are beings on their way to dying, and they don't let themselves deviate from that knowledge. He emphasized that an enormous effort must be employed in order to elicit and maintain this knowledge as a total certainty. Why is it so hard for us to admit something that is so truthful? I asked, bewildered by the magnitude of our internal contradiction. It's really not man's fault, he said, in a conciliatory tone. Someday, I'll tell you more about the forces that drive a man to act like an ass. There wasn't anything else to say. The silence that followed was ominous. I didn't even want to know what the forces were that Don Juan was referring to. It is no great feat for me to assess your professor at a distance, Don Juan went on. He is an immortal scientist. He is never going to die. And when it comes to any concerns about dying, I am sure that he has taken care of them already. He has a plot to be buried in and a hefty life insurance policy that will take care of his family. Having fulfilled those two mandates, he doesn't think about death anymore. He thinks only about his work. Professor Lorca makes sense when he talks, Don Juan continued, because he is prepared to use words accurately. But he's not prepared to take himself seriously as a man who is going to die. Being immortal, he wouldn't know how to do that. It makes no difference what complex machines scientists can build. The machines can in no way help anyone face the unavoidable appointment. The appointment with infinity. The Nawal Julian used to tell me, he went on, about the conquering generals of ancient Rome. When they would return home victorious, gigantic parades were staged to honor them, displaying the treasures that they had won and the defeated people that they had turned into slaves. The conquerors paraded, riding in their war chariots. Riding with them was always a slave whose job was to whisper in their ear that all fame and glory is but transitory. If we are victorious in any way, Don Juan went on, we don't have anyone to whisper in our ear that our victories are fleeting. Sorcerers, however, do have the upper hand. As beings on their way to dying, they have something whispering in their ear that everything is ephemeral. The whisperer is death, the infallible advisor, the only one who won't ever tell you a lie. Saying thank you. Warrior travelers don't leave any debts unpaid, Don Juan said. What are you talking about, Don Juan? I asked. It is time that you square certain indebtedness you have incurred in the course of your life, he said. Not that you will ever pay in full, mind you, but you must make a gesture. You must make a token payment in order to atone, in order to appease infinity. You told me about your two friends who meant so much to you, Patricia Turner and Sandra Flanagan. It's time for you to go and find them, and to make each of them one gift in which you spend everything you have. You have to make 2 gifts that will leave you penniless. That's the gesture. I don't know where they are, Don Juan, I said, almost in a mood of protest. To find them is your challenge. In your search for them, you will not leave any stone unturned. What you intend to do is something very simple, and yet nearly impossible. You want to cross over the threshold of personal indebtedness, and in one sweep, be free in order to proceed. If you cannot cross that threshold, there won't be any point in trying to continue with me. But where did you get the idea of this task for me? I asked. Did you invent it yourself because you think it is appropriate? I don't invent anything, he said, matter-of-factly. I got this task from infinity itself. It's not easy for me to say all this to you. If you think that I'm enjoying myself pink with your tribulations, you're wrong. The success of your mission means more to me than it does to you. If you fail, you have very little to lose. What? Your visits to me? Big deal. But I would lose you, and that means to me losing either the continuity of my lineage or the possibility of your closing it with a golden key. Don Juan stopped talking. He always knew when my mind became feverish with thoughts. I have told you over and over that warrior travelers are pragmatists, he went on. They are not involved in sentimentalism or nostalgia or melancholy. For warrior travelers, there is only one struggle, and it is a struggle with no end. If you think that you have come here to find peace, or that this is a lull in your life, you're wrong. This task of paying your debts is not guided by any feelings that you know about. It is guided by the purest sentiment, the sentiment of a warrior traveler who is about to dive into infinity. And just before he does, he turns around to say thank you to those who favored him. You must face this task with all the gravity it deserves, he continued. It is your last stop before infinity swallows you. In fact, unless a warrior traveler is in a sublime state of being, infinity will not touch him with a 10-foot pole. So don't spare yourself. Don't spare any effort. Push it mercilessly, but elegantly, all the way through. I had met the two people Don Juan had referred to as my two friends who meant so much to me while going to junior college. I used to live in the garage apartment of the house belonging to Patricia Turner's parents. In exchange for room and board, I took care of vacuuming the pool, raking the leaves, putting the trash out, and making breakfast for Patricia and myself. I was also the handyman in the house as well as the family chauffeur. I drove Mrs. Turner to do her shopping, and I bought liquor for Mr. Turner, which I had to sneak into the house and then into his studio. He was an insurance executive who was a solitary drinker. He had promised his family that he was not going to touch the bottle ever again after some serious family altercations due to his excessive drinking. He confessed to me that he had tapered off enormously, but that he needed a swig from time to time. His studio was, of course, off limits to everybody except me. I was supposed to go in to clean it, but what I really did was hide his bottles inside a beam that appeared to support an arc in the ceiling in the studio, but that was actually hollow. I had to sneak the bottles in and sneak the empties out and dump them at the market. Patricia was a drama and music major in college and a fabulous singer. Her goal was to sing in musicals on Broadway. It goes without saying that I fell head over heels in love with Patricia Turner. She was very slim and athletic, a brunette with angular features, and about a head taller than I am, my ultimate requisite for going bananas over any woman. I seemed to fulfill a deep need in her, the need to nurture someone, especially after she realized that her daddy trusted me implicitly. She became my little mommy. I couldn't even open my mouth without her consent. She watched me like a hawk. She even wrote term papers for me, read textbooks, and gave me synopsis of them. And I liked it, but not because I wanted to be nurtured. I don't think that need was ever a part of my cognition. I relished the fact that she did it. I relished her company. She used to take me to the movies daily. She had passes to all the big movie theaters in Los Angeles, given to her father, courtesy of some movie moguls. Mr. Turner never used them himself. He felt that it was beneath his dignity to flash movie passes. The movie clerks always made the recipients of such passes sign a receipt. Patricia had no qualms about signing anything, but sometimes the nasty clerks wanted Miss Turner to sign. And when I went to do that, they were not satisfied with only the signature of Mr. Turner. They demanded a driver's license. One of them, a sassy young guy, made a remark that cracked him up, and me, too, but which sent Patricia into a fit of fury. "I think you're Mr. Turd," he said, with the nastiest smile you could imagine, "not Mr. Turner." I could have sloughed off that remark, but then he subjected us to the profound humiliation of refusing us entrance to see Hercules, starring Steve Reeves. Usually we went everywhere with Patricia's best friend, Sandra Flanagan, who lived next door with her parents. Sandra was quite the opposite of Patricia. She was just as tall, but her face was round, with rosy cheeks and a sensuous mouth. She was healthier than a raccoon. She had no interest in singing. She was only interested in the sensual pleasures of the body. She could eat and drink anything and digest it, And the feature that finished me off about her, after she had polished off her own plate, she managed to do the same with mine. A thing that, being a picky eater, I had never been able to do in all my life. She was also extremely athletic, but in a rough, wholesome way. She could punch like a man and kick like a mule. As a courtesy to Patricia, I used to do the same chores for Sandra's parents that I did for hers. Vacuuming their pool, raking the leaves from their lawn, taking the trash out on trash day, and incinerating papers and flammable trash. That was the time in Los Angeles when the air pollution was increased by the use of backyard incinerators. Perhaps it was because of the proximity or the ease of those young women that I ended up madly in love with both of them. I went to seek advice from a very strange young man who was my friend, Nicholas Van Houten. He had 2 girlfriends, and he lived with both of them, apparently in a state of bliss. He began by giving me, he said, the simplest advice: how to behave in a movie theater if you had 2 girlfriends. He said that whenever he went to a movie with his 2 girlfriends, all his attention was always centered on whoever sat to his left. After a while, the 2 girls would go to the bathroom, and on their return, he would have them change the seating arrangement. Anna would sit where Betty had been sitting, and nobody around them was the wiser. He assured me that this was the first step in a long process of breaking the girls into a matter-of-fact acceptance of the trio situation. Nicholas was rather corny, and he used that trite French expression, ménage à trois. I followed his advice and went to a theater that showed silent movies on Fairfax Avenue in Los Angeles with Patricia and Sandy. I sat Patricia to my left and poured all my attention on her. They went to the bathroom, and when they returned, I told them to switch places. I started then to do what Nicholas Van Houten had advised. But Patricia would not put up with any nonsense like that. She stood up and left the theater, offended, humiliated, and raving mad. I wanted to run after her and apologize, but Sandra stopped me. "Let her go," she said with a poisonous smile. "She's a big girl. She has enough money to get a taxi and go home." I fell for it and remained in the theater, kissing Sandra, rather nervously and filled with guilt. I was in the middle of a passionate kiss when I felt someone pulling me backward by the hair. It was Patricia. The row of seats was loose and tilted backward. Athletic Patricia jumped out of the way before the seats where we were sitting crashed on the row of seats behind. I heard the frightened screams of 2 movie watchers who were sitting at the end of the row by the aisle. Nicholas Van Houten's tip was miserable advice. Patricia, Sandra, and I returned home in absolute silence. We patched up our differences in the midst of very weird promises, tears, the works. The outcome of our 3-sided relationship was that in the end, we nearly destroyed ourselves. We were not prepared for such an endeavor. We didn't know how to resolve the problems of affection, morality, duty, and social mores. I couldn't leave one of them for the other, and they couldn't leave me. One day, at the climax of a tremendous upheaval, and out of sheer desperation, all 3 of us fled in different directions, never to see one another again. I felt devastated. Nothing of what I did could erase their impact on my life. I left Los Angeles and got busy with endless things in an effort to placate my longing. Without exaggerating in the least, I can sincerely say that I fell into the depths of hell. I believe never to emerge again. If it hadn't been for the influence that Don Juan had on my life and my person, I would never have survived my private demons. I told Don Juan that I knew that whatever I had done was wrong, that I had no business engaging such wonderful people in such sordid, stupid shenanigans, that I had no preparation to face. What was wrong, Don Juan said, was that the three of you were lost egomaniacs. Your self-importance nearly destroyed you. If you don't have self-importance, you have only feelings. Humor me, he went on, and do the following simple and direct exercise that could mean the world to you. Remove from your memory of those two girls any statements that you make to yourself, such as, she said this or that to me, and she yelled, and the other one yelled at me. And remain at the level of your feelings. If you hadn't been so self-important, what would you have had as the irreducible residue? My unbiased love for them, I said, nearly choking. And it is less today than it was then, Don Juan asked. No, it isn't, Don Juan, I said in truthfulness, and I felt the same pang of anguish that had chased me for years. This time, embrace them from your silence, he said. Don't be a meager asshole. Embrace them totally for the last time. But intend that this is the last time on earth. Intend it from your darkness. If you are worth your salt, he went on, when you make your gift to them, you'll sum up your entire life twice. Acts of this nature make warriors airborne, almost vaporous. Following Don Juan's commands, I took the task to heart. I realized that if I didn't emerge victorious, Don Juan was not the only one who was going to lose out. I would also lose something, and whatever I was going to lose was as important to me as what Don Juan had described as being important to him. I was going to lose my chance to face infinity and be conscious of it. The memory of Patricia Turner and Sandra Flanagan put me in a terrible frame of mind. The devastating sense of irreparable loss that had chased me all these years was as vivid as ever. When Don Juan exasperated that feeling, I knew for a fact that there are certain things that can remain with us in Don Juan's terms for life, and perhaps beyond. I had to find Patricia Turner and Sandra Flanagan. Don Juan's final recommendation was that if I did find them, I could not stay with them. I could have time only to atone, to envelop each of them with all the affection I felt, without the angry voices of recrimination, self-pity, or egomania. I embarked on the colossal task of finding out what had become of them, where they were. I began by asking questions of the people who knew their parents. Their parents had moved out of Los Angeles, and nobody could give me a lead as to where to find them. There was no one to talk to. I thought of putting a personal ad in the paper, but then I thought that perhaps they had moved out of California. I finally had to hire a private investigator. Through his connections with official offices of records and whatnot, he located them within a couple of weeks. They lived in New York, a short distance from one another, and their friendship was as close as it had ever been. I went to New York and tackled Patricia Turner first. She hadn't made it to stardom on Broadway the way she had wanted to, but she was part of a production. I didn't want to know whether it was in the capacity of a performer or as management. I visited her in her office. She didn't tell me what she did. She was shocked to see me. What we did was just sit together and hold hands and weep. I didn't tell her what I did either. I said that I had come to see her because I wanted to give her a gift that would express my gratitude, and that I was embarking on a journey from which I did not intend to come back. "Why such ominous words?" she asked, apparently genuinely alarmed. "What are you planning to do? Are you ill? You don't look ill." It was a metaphorical statement, I assured her. "I'm going back to South America. I intend to seek my fortune there. The competition is ferocious, and the circumstances are very harsh, that's all. If I want to succeed, I will have to give all I have to it." She seemed relieved and hugged me. She looked the same, except much bigger, much more powerful, more mature, very elegant. I kissed her hands, and the most overwhelming affection enveloped me. Don Juan was right. Deprived of recriminations, all I had were feelings. "I want to make you a gift, Patricia Turner," I said. "Ask me anything you want, and if it is within my means, I'll get it for you." "Did you strike it rich?" she said, and laughed. "What's great about you is that you never had anything, and you never will. Sandra and I talk about you nearly every day. We imagine you parking cars, living off women, etc., etc. I'm sorry we can't help ourselves, but we still love you." I insisted that she tell me what she wanted. She began to weep and laugh at the same time. "Are you going to buy me a mink coat?" she asked me between sobs. I ruffled her hair and said that I would. "If you don't like it, you take it back to the store and get the money back," I said. She laughed and punched me the way she used to. She had to go back to work, and we parted after I promised her that I would come back again to see her, but that if I didn't, I wanted her to understand that the force of my life was pulling me every which way, yet I would keep the memory of her in me for the rest of my life, and perhaps beyond. I did return, but only to see from a distance how they delivered the mink coat to her. I heard her screams of delight. That part of my task was finished. I left, but I wasn't vaporous, the way Don Juan had said I was going to be. I had opened up an old wound, and it had started to bleed. It wasn't quite raining outside. It was a fine mist that seemed to penetrate all the way to the marrow of my bones. Next, I went to see Sandra Flanagan. She lived in one of the suburbs of New York that is reached by train. I knocked on her door. Sandra opened it and looked at me as if I were a ghost. All the color drained out of her face. She was more beautiful than ever. Perhaps because she had filled out and looked as big as a house. "Why you," she stammered, not quite capable of articulating my name. She sobbed, and she seemed indignant and reproachful for a moment. I didn't give her the chance to continue. My silence was total. In the end, it affected her. She let me in, and we sat down in her living room. "What are you doing here?" she said, quite a bit calmer. "You can't stay. I'm a married woman. I have 3 children, and I'm very happy in my marriage." Shooting her words out rapidly, like a machine gun, she told me that her husband was very dependable, not too imaginative, but a good man, that he was not sensual, that she had to be very careful because he tired very easily when they made love, that he got sick easily and sometimes couldn't go to work, but that he had managed to produce 3 beautiful children, and that after her 3rd child, her husband, whose name seemed to be Herbert, had just simply quit. He didn't have it anymore, but it didn't matter to her. I tried to calm her down by assuring her over and over that I had come to visit her only for a moment, that it was not my intention to alter her life or to bother her in any way. I described to her how hard it had been to find her. "I've come here to say goodbye to you," I said, "and to tell you that you are the love of my life. I want to make you a token, gift, a symbol of my gratitude and my undying affection." She seemed to be deeply affected. She smiled openly, the way she used to. The separation between her teeth made her look childlike. I commented to her that she was more beautiful than ever, which was the truth to me. She laughed and said that she was going on a strict diet, and if she had known that I was coming to see her, she would have started her diet a long time ago. But she would start now, and I would find her the next time as lean as she had always been. She reiterated the horror of our life together and how profoundly affected she had been. She had even thought, in spite of being a devout Catholic, of committing suicide. But she had found in her children the solace that she needed. Whatever we had done were quirks of youth that would never be vacuumed away, but had to be swept under the rug. When I asked if there was some gift that I could make to her as a token of my gratitude and affection for her, she laughed and said exactly what Patricia Turner had said, that I didn't have a pot to piss in, nor would I ever have one, because that's the way I was made. I insisted that she name something. "Can you buy me a station wagon where all my children could fit?" she said, laughing. "I want a Pontiac or an Oldsmobile with all the trimmings." She said that knowing in her heart of hearts that I could not possibly make her such a gift, but I did. I drove the dealer's car, following him as he delivered the station wagon to her the next day. And from the parked car where I was hiding, I heard her surprise. But congruous with her sensual being, her surprise was not an expression of delight. It was a bodily reaction, a sob of anguish, of bewilderment. She cried, but I knew that she was not crying because she had received the gift. She was expressing a longing that had echoes in me. I crumpled in the seat of the car. On my train ride to New York and my flight to Los Angeles, the feeling that persisted was that my life was running out. It was running out of me like clutched sand. I didn't feel in any way liberated or changed by saying thank you and goodbye. Quite the contrary. I felt the burden of that weird affection more deeply than ever. I felt like weeping. What ran through my mind over and over were the titles that my friend Rodrigo Cummings had invented for books that were never to be written. He specialized in writing titles. His favorite was We'll All Die in Hollywood. And another was We'll Never Change. And my favorite, the one that I bought for $10, was From the Life and Sins of Rodrigo Cummings. All those titles played in my mind. I was Rodrigo Cummings, and I was stuck in time and space. And I did love 2 women more than my life, and that would never change. And like the rest of my friends, I would die in Hollywood. I told Don Juan all of this in my report of what I considered to be my pseudo-success. He discarded it shamelessly. He said that what I felt was merely the result of indulging and self-pity, and that in order to say goodbye and thank you, and really mean it and sustain it, sorcerers had to remake themselves. Vanquish your self-pity right now, he demanded. Vanquish the idea that you are hurt. And what do you have as the irreducible residue? What I had as the irreducible residue was the feeling that I had made my ultimate gift to both of them. Not in the spirit of renewing anything or harming anyone, including myself, but in the true spirit that Don Juan had tried to point out to me. In the spirit of a warrior traveler whose only virtue, he had said, is to keep alive the memory of whatever has affected him, whose only way to say thank you and goodbye was by this act of magic, of storing in his silence whatever he has loved.